Chapter 111, Such Hurtful Words. It's slightly painful, but I'm fine, she said again. Though the sight of being ganged upon and beaten was truly frightening, only some of the kicks were painful and they were pulling on her for the rest of the time. Thus, the injuries were not severe. Seeing the red traces on her arms from the scratching, she flattened her lips and cried out, "It hurts." Yin Shoji saw that, and his handsome face turned gloomy. With a piercing gaze, he scanned the girls and said in an icy voice that would cause one to quiver, "Who scratched her?" The girls were all frightened by his cold expression. They had never seen young Master Ji like this. They trembled with fear and retreated a step. "And who kicked her?" Yin Shoji shouted again. The two girls who kicked Mu Xiaoxiao showed fear on their faces. They tried to conceal it, but Yin Shoji had already seen through them. His cold gaze was fixated on their faces. The two girls were scared pale, and their whole bodies began trembling. "Young Master Ji, it's not like that. We didn't mean it." At this moment, Hazue glowered at Mu Xiaoxiao. She pointed at her and said furiously, "Mu Xiaoxiao, you said that there was nothing between you and young Master Ji. You're liar. You're big liar. Slut." Seeing Yin Shoji looking as if he was going to stick up for her, Hazue was infuriated and lost her senses. "If not for Yin Shoji, I would have run up to scratch this slut's face." Hearing that, Yin Shoji frowned. His dark eyes looked at Mu Xiaoxiao, who was in his arms, and he let go of her. He asked, in a rather impersonal tone, "You really told them that there was nothing between us?" Noticing his anger, Mu Xiaoxiao was slightly anxious. She steadied herself and said hesitantly, Hazue looked at Yin Shoji. Bearing her last hope, she asked, "Yin Shoji, is there anything between the two of you?" "There's nothing between you two, right? Then why are you so concerned for her?" Mu Xiaoxiao couldn't help but feel uneasy. She thought she might have hurt Yin Shoji. Just as she was about to explain. Suddenly, a voice said coldly, "There's nothing between us." Mu Xiaoxiao was motionless. He said that there was nothing between us. She didn't think that he would say that. Her heart felt as if it had been crushed below a boulder. She was hurt and aggrieved. She was clearly the one who had first denied their relationship and the one who had said that she didn't want others to know of the relationship. But upon hearing his answer, she still felt her heart ache. She was upset. Her dark eyes grew watery. She finally understood why he was mad. It was so hurtful. "I'm sorry, Ji," she whimpered, as tears formed in her eyes. Hazue was delighted after getting the answer that she wanted to hear. She immediately stared at Mu Xiaoxiao and said proudly, "Young Master Ji has spoken. He has nothing to do with you. You slut. Don't think that young Master Ji will pity you for your tears." As he heard her calling names, Yin Shoji was extremely annoyed, and he shouted sternly, "You, shut your mouth." Hazue felt wronged. Young Master Ji, as he saw a clear teardrop rolling down Mu Xiaoxiao's cheeks, Yin Shoji felt as if a blow had been dealt to his heart. Chapter 112 made him confused. SHT. Yin Shoji cursed under his breath. He stretched his long arms around Mu Xiaoxiao and pulled her into his embrace. Vexed, he said to her by her ear, "Damn. Stop crying." Upon seeing her tears, he had already regretted his earlier impulse. He got mad from just hearing how she was telling others that there was nothing between them. Thus, he thought of spiting her and letting her taste her own medicine. Who knew that the wretch would play dirty, crying at will and catching him off guard? Her actions had left him confused. Mu Xiaoxiao leaned her head on his chest, and she sobbed softly, "Ji, I'm wrong. I shouldn't have said those things, boo-hoo. Don't be mad. I'm sorry, all right. I won't be mad. I forgive you, all right. Stop crying," Yin Shoji couldn't help but say in a gentler voice. His thick and broad palm held the back of her head to calm her down. Mu Xiaoxiao sniffed, and she stopped her tears. Then, the onlookers who saw this sight all looked on in astonishment. Since the huge commotion, most of the students left their lessons and came out to stand around and watch. At this moment, a lot of people were watching upstairs in the block. When everyone saw such a sight, they looked at each other and couldn't help but start having their own discussions. How exactly is this girl related to Yin Shoji? Yin Shoji had never been seen acting so intimately toward a girl. He was even so protective and loving toward her. It was a sight too dazzling for everyone. From their perspective, the way that Yin Shoji and Mu Xiaoxiao were interacting with each other was totally what a couple would do when at odds with each other. As Hazue watched this scene, she gritted her teeth and wished that she could just pull them apart so that Mu Xiaoxiao would not be able to touch the man she loved. But Yin Shoji's fearsome look intimidated her and she didn't even dare to move. Why, young Master Ji? She finally found her voice and she said to him, didn't you say that Mu Xiao had nothing to do with you? Why are you, at this moment, the look of Yin Shoji giving Mu Xiao his utmost care and protection made her grit her teeth with hatred and she bit her lower lip till it turned pale. The girls beside her all looked heartbroken. One of them even clasped her mouth and broke into tears. Hearing Ha Zue's voice, Yin Shoji raised his head to stare at her coldly, and he said contemptuously, who are you? Do I owe you an explanation about our relationship? Ha Zue looked hurt, and she said agitatedly, I'm the president of your fan club. I'm not just anyone. However, Yin Shoji slanted his mouth as he responded with ridicule, I've never acknowledged these things. You can do that at your own leisure, and I won't care about it. But don't think that makes you anyone significant. Ha Zue was clearly dealt a huge blow. She looked to be on the verge of collapse. How could he say that? She had always thought that since she was the president of his fan club, he would be aware of her existence, and she thought that she was someone special to him. However, he had burst her bubble. He told her that he had no idea of who she was, and he didn't care for the club that she had established for him. He even looked at her with disgust. Ha Zue glared at Mu Xiao with a hateful gaze, her eyes red, and she shrieked furiously, it's you. It's all your fault. If you hadn't seduced young Master Ji, he wouldn't have treated me this way. You lowly peasant. What right do you have to be with young Master Ji? You should go to hell. Chapter 113, Don't let a single one get away. Ha Zue had almost lost her wits as she threw herself at Mu Xiao to mess her up. Yin Shoji grabbed Ha Zue by her wrist and gripped it tightly, and he said fiercely, you dare to touch her. Do you have a death wish? Hurts, it hurts. Ha Zue broke into tears from the pain. She was a frail girl from a wealthy family and had never been mistreated like this before. What's more, it was her Prince Charming who she had admired for so long who did this to her. But Yin Shoji was not fazed by her tears. Mu Xiao quickly reached out to stop him lest he really injured someone. But just as she raised her arm, she gasped in deep pain and cried out, hurts, what happened? Yin Shoji noticed it, and he suddenly flung Ha Zue aside. He raised her arms and had a look. Her arm, which was usually fair and delicate, was bleeding with cuts all over it. It looked dreadful. How did you get injured like this? He was startled, and he turned his penetrating gaze toward Ha Zue and the bunch of girls, making the atmosphere uncomfortable. You did it. He turned to look at Mu Xiao's body, and he said anxiously, didn't you say you were fine? How is this fine? It shocked him when he saw that her palm was still bleeding. I forgot, okay. Mu Xiao sulked as she pouted her little mouth. The situation was too dangerous just now when she had been surrounded and beaten by the girls. She had been more concerned with staying alive than caring about the injury on her hand. Let's go. I'm taking you to the school's clinic. Yin Shoji frowned and said. With the severity of her injury, she should be going to the hospital. However, Shangde High's clinic was unlike other schools. It had a comprehensive set of facilities and resources, and it was like a mini private hospital. Wait, after taking only 2 steps, Mu Xiao frowned. Even though she was not critically injured, she could still feel the ache as she walked from the beating she had received. Yin Shoji gave her a look. He then carried her by her waist, and he scolded her, stop saying you're all right. With a fierce expression, he scanned the girls again, and he said callously to Wu Hao behind him, you watch them. Don't let a single one of them get away. I'll be back to deal with them. His assistant, Wu Hao, who had seen most of his methods, couldn't help but shudder and feel pity for these girls. He replied respectfully, understood, young Master Ji. Upon hearing these words, the girls felt unprecedented fear. Some of them fell to the ground and plead for mercy, young Master Ji. We've learned from our mistakes. Boo-hoo. We won't dare to do that again. Wu Hao laughed dispassionately on the inside. You should be happy. Young Master Ji doesn't beat ladies. However, young Master Ji has his ways to make you plead for death. Mu Xiao heard the cries and she couldn't bear it. The girls seemed to be truly afraid. They were pale and pleading for mercy. Ji, she was just going to speak, but Yin Shoji glared at her as if he knew what she was going to say. Displeased, he said, you shut up. Don't say a word. Just hold on to me tightly. Mu Xiao had no choice but to hold on to his neck with her small hands in embarrassment. Yin Shoji was just about to go when he suddenly stopped. He turned to look at Ha Zue and smiled with pursed lips. He said, didn't you want to know what our relationship was? Fine, I'll tell you. Hazue looked at him in a daze. Her body was trembling. Suddenly, she had a strong feeling that it was an answer she wouldn't want to hear. Chapter 114, announcing her status to everyone like an emperor, Yin Shoji looked down proudly upon and around at the onlookers. He raised his voice and announced, she is my wife. Is that clear? In an instant, Hazue's face turned pale. The crowd at the school block were all stunned. They were either staring with bulging eyes or with their mouths wide open. For a moment, the air was quiet, and only the sound of birds on the trees could be heard. Yin Shoji sneered. He paid no more attention to these people, and he carried Mu Xiaoxiao towards the school's clinic. When they walked a fair distance away, Mu Xiaoxiao looked at him with narrowed eyes and said with some dissatisfaction, why did you have to say that? Displeased, Yin Shoji looked down at her, and he said deliberately, why? You're going to deny our relationship again. No. Mu Xiaoxiao still felt slightly guilty, and she didn't dare to think about doing that again. She said, you could say I'm your girlfriend or something else. You don't have to say that I'm your wife. Yin Shoji snorted bossily and said, it's my mouth, and I will say whatever I want. Mu Xiaoxiao was speechless. All right, she is speechless. Luckily the school clinic wasn't too far. It only took a few minutes to reach it. Yin Shoji kicked open the door and carried her to a bed, and he sat her down on the bed. Doctor, he shouted urgently. Within a few seconds, a figure came running out. I'm coming. I'm coming. As the doctor was still approaching, Yin Shoji stared at him with a stern gaze and shouted, can you be faster? You're slow. The doctor wiped the sweat off his forehead, and he quickened his steps toward them. He stood beside him and bent at his waist, saying, young Master Ji, what's the problem? Can't you see the patient is here? Her hand is injured. Treat it quickly. Yin Shoji was really irritable. He restrained and calmed down as he kept a watchful eye on the doctor. The doctor quickly turned towards Mu Xiaoxiao and examined her wounds. It's only a graze on the hand. It's nothing serious. Seeing young Master Ji's anxious look, he thought that the injuries would be more severe. Although the doctor was mocking him inwardly, he didn't dare to reveal his thoughts, and he swiftly attended to Mu Xiaoxiao's wounds. In a few minutes, the wounds were properly bandaged. Then, Yin Shoji frowned and said, she was kicked a few times. I don't know if there are any internal injuries. Take a look at it. Okay, young Master Ji. The doctor stood up. He turned to face Mu Xiaoxiao, and he was about to reach out his hand. Wait, what do you think you're doing? He jumped in fright from Yin Shoji's shout before he even touched Mu Xiaoxiao's clothes. Young Master Ji's expression was as if he was fighting off a pervert. The doctor wiped away his cold sweat again. He carefully explained, young Master Ji, don't you want me to examine her? Yin Shoji furrowed his brows. He considered for a moment and said, I don't want you anymore. Get me a female doctor here. Quickly. All right, I'll go right away. The doctor sighed with relief and ran out in haste. Mu Xiaoxiao sat on the sickbed and shook her legs. Seeing that the doctor had gone far away, she said, don't be so fierce. I'm all right. You don't have to worry. He raised her bandaged arms and brought it closer for him to see. She said, it's much better now. After the sterilization and application of the medication, the wound feels refreshed, and it was not as painful as before. Yin Shoji saw that she could still smile. He couldn't help but pinch her on her nose, and he said dishonestly, who's worrying about you? Don't flatter yourself. However, it was at this moment that the tense feeling in his heart was finally relieved. Chapter 115, Depraved Thoughts. Mu Xiaoxiao was laughing heartily. She raised her eyebrows as she looked at him and mocked, you don't worry about me. You were so nervous just now. You looked like you wanted to kill people just a while ago. Isn't that worrying about me? As she thought about the way he looked, she felt so happy. Of course, she still needed lots of sweetness and warmth. She didn't think that he would be so nervous for her. All the time they spent together in their childhood wasn't wasted. You're really, stop with the nonsense. It's not time to talk about this. Are you sorry now? Yin Shoji looked unnatural as he deliberately changed the subject. He didn't want her to continue talking about the topic because she would mock him and it would be hard to rebut her. As Mu Xiaoxiao thought about the danger earlier, she couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief and say, aren't these girls too terrifying? I've never experienced this in America. Yin Shoji narrowed his eyes as he looked at her, and he asked in a rather strange tone, so you're regretting coming back? Mu Xiaoxiao was about to nod her head when she glanced at him and noticed he was slightly displeased. She quickly smiled and said, "Of course not. You're here, aren't you? With your protecting me, I won't have to be afraid of others anymore." "You don't say. With my protection, no one dares to touch you," Yin Shoji said arrogantly. At this point, almost the whole school should have known about his announcement. Unless anyone really had a beef with him, no one would dare to touch her. Mu Xiaoxiao lazily stretched her back and pulled on the painful area at her stomach. She frowned slightly as she stroked the painful area at her abdomen, and she said gloomily, "I'm really unlucky. I just had to provoke those crazy girls. They say that girls could be madly in love." Now she had finally seen it for herself. Yin Shoji noticed her action. "Is it painful?" He frowned. He looked outside the door, and he said angrily, "Where's the female doctor? Is she dead?" By coincidence, the female doctor had just arrived at the door. When she heard the shout, she walked in, trembling with fear. "Young Master Ji, I came as fast as I could." Even though it was only a clinic, the building area was not small. It required some time to come down from the third floor. Yin Shoji stared at her with a strict expression and said, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and examine her." Okay. The female doctor responded and nodded. She walked to the side of the bed. She touched Mu Xiaoxiao over her clothes, and then, she very naturally lifted her shirt. Yin Shoji happened to be keeping an eye on the female doctor's actions. When she lifted her shirt, he naturally saw Mu Xiaoxiao's flat, fair abdomen. Moreover, since the female doctor had lifted the shirt quite high, he could even vaguely see the edge of her bra. He looked slightly uncomfortable and turned his gaze away. But in his mind, he could not forget the edge of her bra. It was pink. Could it also have strawberry patterns? As he thought about it, he couldn't help but remember the strawberry panties from last time. A certain handsome face blushed. However, his mind could not be restrained as an image surfaced. It was the image of Mu Xiaoxiao wearing a complete set of strawberry patterned lingerie. Yin Shoji. Mu Xiaoxiao stared at his handsome face. Her clear, melodious voice, which was like the sound of silver bells, called out to him. Yin Shoji then suddenly returned to reality. He even choked on his own saliva as he said, what? He was flustered because his depraved thoughts might be exposed. Chapter 116, You're blaming me. Mu Xiaoxiao thought that he was acting oddly. She looked at him suspiciously, and she couldn't help but ask, "What were you dreaming about just now?" "Nothing." Yin Shoji acted like nothing had happened, and he looked towards the female doctor and asked, "So how's her condition looking?" The female doctor put down Mu Xiaoxiao's shirt, and she replied, "From my initial inspection, there seems to be no injury to the internal organs. However, since the student is covered in dirt, there may be injuries in other places. Therefore, I would like to do a more detailed examination." "Yeah, do it then." Yin Shoji coughed and stood up. He said to Mu Xiaoxiao, "You just stay here, and I'll go settle some business outside. I'll be back quickly. Don't run away, okay?" "Okay," Mu Xiaoxiao obediently replied. Yin Shoji was only satisfied after hearing her reply. He looked at the female doctor and warned her, "Take good care of her." "I understand, young Master Ji. Don't worry," the female doctor replied. Yin Shoji then felt reassured, and he left the school's clinic. Back at the scene of the incident, Wu Hao had found some helpers from somewhere. They surrounded the girls, who numbered more than 10, to prevent them from escaping. Seeing Yin Shoji's return, Wu Hao quickly received him and nodded as he said, "Young Master Ji, all of them are here just as you instructed." "Yeah." Yin Shoji nodded satisfactorily as he cast a cold gaze at the girls. Although the class bell had rung, there were still lots of students watching, curious to see how he would deal with the incident. Yin Shoji smiled. The girls were weeping endlessly. When they saw him return, they pleaded softly for mercy, saying that they were in the wrong and that they wouldn't dare to do it again. Only Ha Zue, who was standing in front, looked gloomy as she refused to give in. Yin Shoji walked with his long legs and stood before them, and he shouted sternly, "Whoever kicked her, step out now." He could still remember the two girls from before. He scanned them with his sharp gaze to see if they dared to admit their deeds. However, facing his terrifying expression, no one dared to step out. They withdrew timidly and didn't dare to utter a word. "You dared to do the deed, yet you won't take responsibility." He scoffed. The two girls whom he glared at instantly collapsed to the ground as their legs gave way. They crawled out with tears in their eyes, saying, "It's us, young Master Ji. We didn't mean to do it. We didn't know she was so important to you. We thought that she was trying to seduce you using her schemes, so if we knew she was yours, we definitely wouldn't have touched her. Please believe us. So you're saying that it's my fault. You're blaming me. Yin Shoji slanted his mouth in a cold expression. The two girls were trembling with fright and they shook their heads frantically and said no. It's our fault. It's our fault. Yin Shoji gave Wu Hao a look. Although he was laughing bitterly inside, Wu Hao understood and nodded. Young Master Ji didn't want to dirty his hands by beating girls, but he would ask others to do it for him. Wu Hao obediently followed his orders and instructed two guys to take the two girls away to be punished. This time, Yin Shoji turned his gaze to Hazuer. In the past, Hazuer had always wished that Yin Shoji would spare her a glance. But now that she had her wish fulfilled in these circumstances, she wasn't celebrating. There was only fear emanating from her heart. She heard two girls' miserable shrieks from the side. The guys were forceful. In just a little while, their faces were already swollen and red. Unwavering, Hazuer gritted her teeth and she wouldn't admit that she had a part in kicking Mu Xiaoxiao. Chapter 117, Settling Accounts. Does she think that if she just refuses to admit it that he won't be able to find out? Yin Shoji stared coldly at her. The intense pressure almost took over Hazuer. Still, she said nothing. She lowered her head and kept silent. Very good. Yin Shoji pursed his slender lips, looking indifferent. The depth in his gaze kept his thoughts well hidden. His gaze shifted from her to the other girls. Suddenly, he ordered, kneel. All of you. The girls looked at him, stunned. The two girls who had been punished were dragged back to their original positions. Yin Shoji said gravely, I want you all to walk on your knees all the way to the school's clinic and apologize to Mu Xiaoxiao. The girls were stunned as they stared with eyes widened, yet not a single one dared to speak against him. At this moment, one of the girls knelt down. In response, the other girls followed suit and hurried onto their knees. Only Hazuer was left standing. She was still resisting and biting on her lips, which had turned pale. Seeing that Yin Shoji had not forced her to admit, she thought that he would not treat her too harshly given her status. She was, after all, the wealthy daughter of the Hans Corporation. She had also heard from her father that their family had businesses with the Yin family. Perhaps, Yin Shoji was taking into consideration the relationship between the two families. Hazuer felt a little delighted. In any case, I'm different from the others, and Yin Shoji wouldn't dare to treat me badly. However, a pair of long legs walked towards her. Hazuer saw it and instinctively raised her head. When she looked up to see Yin Shoji's expression, her heart trembled. He smiled. But his smile was terrifying. Why, young Master Ji, she trembled as she called out in pitiful voice in an attempt to gain his pity. However, she had miscalculated. Yin Shoji could only feel tenderness towards Mu Xiaoxiao. The cold, severe expression staring at her was unmoved. Yin Shoji looked cruel as he smiled and said, You don't want to kneel. You have some spine. I just don't know whether you still have any spine left when your family is ruined. How long do you think it would take for me to collapse the Hans Corporation? Hazuer looked at him, shaking. Her whole body seemed to have been drained of blood as she shuddered. At this moment, she thought that the man before her was a demon. She knew that he dared to do it, and he would do it for real. Moreover, with the Yin family's power, Yin Shoji would only need a short time to collapse a corporation if he wanted to. Hazuer turned pale. She fell on her knees with a loud pop, and tears rolled down her cheeks miserably. Good girl. Yin Shoji satanically smiled. The onlookers were stupefied. Though it was known that Yin Shoji had the greatest power at Shangde, no one could imagine that young Master Ji would start a war over one girl. With this, it was clear to everyone that young Master Ji held Mu Xiaoxiao in high regards. Yin Shoji turned around and walked towards the school's clinic. Following behind him were more than 10 girls on their knees. The scene was simply comical. There were several girls who were disapproving of Hazuer's usual arrogance. Hazuer had been tyrannically abusing others by leveraging her position as the president of young Master Ji's fan club. Thus, the girls secretly laughed as they saw her in such a sorry state. The guys were mostly there for the show. Everyone went along to the school's clinic in anticipation for the events that would ensue. Chapter 118, The other side of him. At the school's clinic, Mu Xiaoxiao was having the female doctor apply medication on the bruised areas when she suddenly heard a commotion. It seems like it is coming from downstairs. Doctor, did you hear anything? Just as she was going to ask, someone called out her name. Mu Xiao Xiao. I'm sorry. Please forgive us. However, it wasn't just a single cry. The cries continued unceasingly. Mu Xiao Xiao was embarrassed. What is this situation? Could it be that Yin Shoji had sought the girls to settle accounts? Did he bring them here to apologize? At this moment, Yin Shoji walked in. The first thing he did was look at the female doctor, and he asked, "Are you done with the examination? How's her situation?" The female doctor quickly stood up and reported, "Her injuries are not heavy. It's just a superficial wound and will be better after some medication." Okay. Yin Shoji felt reassured. He walked over to help up Mu Xiao Xiao and said, "Come, I have something to show you." Mu Xiao Xiao looked at his handsome face as she confirmed her earlier guess, and she was all smiles. However, as she walked to the balcony and saw the situation downstairs, she was stunned. More than 10 girls, including Ha Zuer, were kneeling on the ground. They were kowtowing and begging for her forgiveness. Mu Xiao Xiao was stupefied. She turned toward him, staring blankly as she asked, "What's the situation?" Smiling, Yin Shoji said, "They are apologizing to you. Just watch. We can let them go once you feel better." Mu Xiao Xiao was unsure whether to laugh or cry. This is too dramatic. Though she hated these girls since they had bullied her and shown no mercy when beating her up, she still felt a little uncomfortable looking at the scene. So many of them were kowtowing to her. It was all too horrifying. Finally, she couldn't bear it, and she said to him, "Forget it. Forget it. Let them stop. I feel quite uncomfortable watching this." The girls below were all pampered girls from wealthy families, and they had never been through such grievances. Their faces were all stained with tears. Yin Shoji looked askance at her and said, "So fast. Don't grow soft on them. Just think about how they were harming you back then. They weren't soft on you." Mu Xiao Xiao noticed that the girls' knees were filthy. Since some of them were wearing skirts, their knees were also grazed. She frowned and suddenly had a horrifying thought. They didn't come here on their knees, did they? She looked at him in blankly. Yin Shoji nodded indifferently. "Yeah. Did you think I would let them go so easily? They dared to harm you. This is only a small price to pay. I have been lenient." Mu Xiao Xiao was speechless. This is leniency. If he hadn't been lenient, what could have happened? Mu Xiao Xiao couldn't imagine, but she had seen this cruel side of him for the first time. Without her forgiveness, the girls continued to kowtow, and they didn't dare to stop. Mu Xiao Xiao simply disliked such a sight. Seeing that Yin Shoji wouldn't help her, she stepped forward and said to the girls, "All right, I forgive you." The girls finally stopped their movements. Yin Shoji looked at her disapprovingly and clicked his tongue. He pulled her into his arms and took her into the building. "If you don't like what you see, then we'll stop watching." Chapter 119, You're so annoying. Next time, can you discuss it with me before you do anything? Mu Xiao Xiao sighed and said as she stared at him. If she had seen too much of that, she was afraid that she would have nightmares. Yin Shoji turned a deaf ear. He took the medication from the female doctor, and he got into a half-squat posture in front of her. "Get on. I'll take you home." "No need. I'm much better now. I can walk by myself." Mu Xiao Xiao instinctively rejected him. Especially after seeing the female doctor's shocked expression, she didn't want Yin Shoji to carry her. Yin Shoji turned back and glanced at her, and he said bossily, "Get up quickly, you hear." Mu Xiao Xiao had no choice but to lay on his back embarrassingly. Yin Shoji carried her on his back and left the school's clinic. As they walked out of the school's clinic, the people outside had not scattered. As they saw Yin Shoji carrying Mu Xiao Xiao, they were stunned as if they had just seen an unbelievable scene out of a fantasy story. Mu Xiao Xiao felt embarrassed, and she simply dug her face into his shoulders as she pretended not to see anything. Yin Shoji paid no attention to how the others were looking at them as he carried her to the parking lot. The two walked in the hallway. Fortunately, classes were going on and there weren't many people around. Mu Xiao Xiao finally began to feel at ease. She stared at his handsome face from the side. Suddenly, she thought of something and said resentfully, "See, I told you. I'm not that heavy. You're not even panting after carrying me for so long." Seeing that she could still joke, Yin Shoji thought that she was feeling all right. He then deliberately said in a derisive tone, "You're so heavy, yet you still have the gall to talk like that. I just happen to be strong, which is why I'm not panting. If some other guy was carrying you, he wouldn't last a few steps." Yin Shoji, "You're so annoying." Mu Xiaoxiao grew mad and hit his shoulders. He was just sticking out for her a while ago, and now, he was mocking her. Fat little pig. It's painful, okay. You're saying it again. You're saying it again. The two continued frolicking until they reached the parking lot. Yin Shoji put her in the car and they drove out of school. Mu Xiaoxiao fell asleep in the car, perhaps because of the torture that she had been through. Back at the luxurious condominium, the sports car steadily came to a stop in the parking lot. Yin Shoji turned his head and saw that she was sleeping soundly. You are a little pig, sleeping at will. Yin Shoji smiled while looking at her. He reached out his hand to tap her cute nose. Stop messing around, go away. Mu Xiaoxiao waved her little hand to pat the disturbing fly. Yin Shoji saw her adorable look, and he smiled. He got out of the car, walked over to the other side, and carried her out horizontally. Mu Xiaoxiao was leaning on his strong shoulders. His body was warm and comforting. Yin Shoji carried her into the lift and up to their apartment. They entered the apartment, and he placed her on the sofa in the living room. He sat down on the carpet, and his deep gaze watched her fair, delicate face. His gaze fell upon her lips, and for a moment, it stayed there. Something stirred in his eyes, and his heart thumped wildly as if a lion was hidden within him. He couldn't bear it, and he reached out his hand to touch her. This wretch's face is as soft as a marshmallow. It feels so good to the touch that anyone would want to pinch it. Yin Shoji didn't know restraint. He had always done anything that he desired. Thus, he lifted himself and moved closer. Chapter 120, What a poor sleeping posture. Mu Xiaoxiao suddenly moved. Her eyelashes fluttered like a butterfly's wings as if she had woken up. Yin Shoji panicked as he stepped back and bumped into the coffee table, almost falling down. However, the person lying on the sofa had only turned her body to face outward and smacked her lips before she steadily returned to sleep again. Yin Shoji stayed still as he stared at her face for a long while. The air was so quiet that it seemed as if it was frozen, and one could hear a pin drop. He then realized that she hadn't actually noticed anything and wasn't going to wake up anytime soon. It was common for people to turn in their sleep. He had been afraid for nothing. As he stared at her sleeping face with his dark eyes, Yin Shoji clicked his tongue and pretended to say in a derisive tone, "What a poor sleeping posture." However, he was only so nervous because he had a guilty conscience and thought that he had been found out. He stood up, and his tall body moved closer. Just as he was going to pinch her cheeks, he heard a ringtone. It came from Mu Xiaoxiao's phone in her pocket. Mu Xiaoxiao was alarmed by the ringtone, and her eyebrows were knitted as if she was reluctant to wake up. Yin Shoji quickly reached into her pocket to get the phone lest she got woken up. However, when he saw the caller ID, he squinted his eyes in displeasure. Lu Yichen. He stared at Mu Xiaoxiao. This wretch actually has Lu Yichen's phone number. Just how close are they? The ringtone was still ringing. Seeing the name on the screen flickering, Yin Shoji grew mad. Without hesitation, he hung up the call. He added the number to the blacklist and deleted the contact from the address book. Yin Shoji completed the few steps all in one go without feeling a tinge of guilt, and he placed the phone onto the coffee table. He looked down to stare at Mu Xiaoxiao, who was sound asleep. Dissatisfied, he reached out and pinched her nose. Little wretch, you're seducing guys everywhere. Do you even care about your husband? It's bad enough that you're hanging out with other guys. But of all people, you had to hang out with Lu Yichen. I clearly told her that I had a beef with Lu Yichen. But she just turned a deaf ear and continued to see that guy, even exchanging phone numbers in just a few days of meeting him. Why can't I remember the last time Lu Yichen was so good to hang out with? Just thinking about how Lu Yichen had treated this little wretch differently from how he treated others, he grew sulky and angry. Mu Xiaoxiao was being pinched on her nose. The lack of air was very uncomfortable, and she was about to get suffocated. She turned her head to resist it and unconsciously opened her mouth to breathe instead. Yin Shoji gazed at her lips. The look of her, especially as her small mouth was slightly opened, seemed to be inviting him to kiss it. He regretted how he had been scared off by her earlier. Mu Xiaoxiao was lacking oxygen, and she struggled to breathe. She turned and finally woke up. She uttered a soft sound. This time, Yin Shoji was responsive. He lowered his head and looked at her face to see if she was really about to wake up or just whimpering in her sleep. Unfortunately, Mu Xiaoxiao had really woken up, and he was disappointed. Yin Shoji saw her eyelid lifting, and he knew that she was waking up. He quickly stood up and moved away from her, pretending that nothing had happened. Mu Xiaoxiao opened her eyes in a daze, and she looked